If you want to keep your kit in good order and your rucksack clean and undamaged, here's a few tips, so stay tuned. Although it is always a good idea to keep the weight of your pack down, sometimes you have to have intermediate packing. I discovered some woven but coated and therefore waterproof material. This I thought would be great for making a cover for a knife, fork, spoon set, because it could be sponged down if ever it got dirty. As this material did not fray when it was cut, there was no need to have extensive seams. Once the size had been detected, the edge was rolled over and then rolled over again to hold down the cordage. Because of the nature of the material, it was easy to glue it and then to sew it. Once the cordage had been sewn in place, the fabric was folded over. The knife, fork, spoon was placed on top, and a sewing line was marked. It was kept in place with pins and then sewn from top to bottom and then bottom to top. Once the sewing was completed, the knife, fork, spoon set was placed inside and the bottom was secured with stitching as well. The excess material was trimmed off, but it was found that the way of stitching the bottom was not very good, so the stitching was taken out and the bottom was stitched differently. Once everything was complete, the whole sheath was turned inside out. The sheath will keep the knife, fork, spoon set together, it'll stop it rattling, and it'll make it easy to find if it's in a larger sack instead of being stowed away properly. Solid fuel stoves are a handy addition to any rucksack. They're cheap, they're easy to use, however they tend to be made out of pressed metal which has sharp edges, and this causes damage to other items in your carrying equipment. Initially, I decided to make a cover for the stove out of thin shirt material. However, this was too thin and would tear easily. I decided I would make a new one out of material from an old pair of jeans. As before, the first part of the process was to roughly mark out the area of the material required and then pin it to make sure that the sizes were correct. Once it was pinned, then it was time to trim off any excess, roll over the end and stitch it down in order to make a channel for a draw cord. The next stage was to sew the thing together. Should I use a single strand of thread? This was quick, this was easy, and you tended not to get any knots as you were sewing. Or do I use a doubled over thread, which is stronger? However, this takes more effort and is prone to getting knots in it, which are difficult to get out. I used a dedicated cord puller to get the draw cord through the channel. Then I sewed the bottom. I had the middle seam in the middle of the stitching. Having the seam in the middle for the knife, fork and spoon set was a good idea, but it wasn't a good idea for the stove cover, so I moved the seam to the side and sewed along the bottom before turning it inside out. I now have a heavy duty cover for the solid fuel stove that will protect everything else in the rucksack and the rucksack itself. I decided I needed a thin cloth cover for my mess tin set, basically just to stop it dirtying any other items of equipment when it hadn't been properly cleaned. Because the mess tin set was round, I decided it would have to be made of two separate pieces of material, a round base and a flat, straight wall that could be tied in over the top. As before, the first job was to work out the length of the materials that I required. The mess tin was placed at one end, rolled over through 360 degrees and the end point marked. Subsequently, the cloth was cut to the right size. The lid, which is slightly bigger than the base, was placed on a sheet of material. It was drawn round. Then a slightly larger circle was drawn. This would be the stitch line, and then a third, even larger circle was drawn. This would be the cutting outline. This would allow for the material fraying. A channel for the draw cord was added. It was stitched down with contrasting thread. After all, this is going to be a piece of protective equipment, not a fashion item. Using contrasting thread makes it easy to see the stitches. The cordage channel was placed more or less in the middle of the mess tin and draped down the side. The required length was marked, material for the hem was calculated, and it was cut to size. Then the two pieces of material were pinned together to see if they actually fitted. They were tested against the mess tin. They were the correct size. The pieces of material were stitched together using the normal stitching. The stitches were sewn in one direction and then reversed. This is a simple method, but it results in a good, strong joint that'll last. Then the excess material was trimmed away and the bag was turned the right way out. Finally, odd little improvements like finishing off the cordage channel were done. With some basic materials that you've probably got in your home anyway, and some simple sewing techniques, you can produce containers that will keep your gear and your rucksack clean, tidy and protected. With your kit properly stowed and your rucksack all safe, get out there, get training. You know it makes sense. It'll serve you well. Thank you for watching, commenting and hopefully subscribing.